The Beatles once sang, "As we reflect on the legacy of the Fab Four, we are fast approaching 50 years since the Beatles first arrived in the U.S.
Historically, you can see they came over here at a time when American pop music wasn't quite too exciting.
For most baby boomers of that age, it was pretty much a seismic cultural occurrence.
Nobody moved so far, so fast, and took so many people with them.
They're influential, but it's hard to replicate what they did.
The Beatles became the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed act in the history of popular music. Their influence went beyond music and spread into culture, fashion, and society.
Something in the way she moves.
In this edition of Tennessee Matters, we look back at the music of the Beatles, the impact, their significance here in Music City, and their legacy.
Here comes the sun, I say it's alright.
By the early 1960s, the pop music status had changed for stars like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis, according to professor and coordinator of commercial music at Tennessee State University, Dr. Mark Crawford.
Elvis was in the Army, Buddy had died, Carl fell from the charts, Jerry Lee married his cousin. So when the Beatles hit, they were filling a void.
I'm in love with her and I feel fine.
In November 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated, Crawford says that really put a damper on the country's mood, especially with young people.
And so the Beatles were refreshing, they were new, they were cute, they were funny, they were reinterpreting American pop music. There's many ways they shook things up, not only the music, but the look, the attitude, just we might call it a vibe today, their overall vibe.
Well, shake it up, baby, now. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, come on. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Experts say there are distinct eras to the Beatles' music, starting with their rise to fame in the early years of Beatlemania.
Well, she was just 17, if you know what I mean. There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed. For tomorrow may rain, so I'll follow the sun.
TSU professor Mark Crawford says there is something that really set the Beatles apart from other musicians.
And so, my love, I must go.
Musically speaking, their use of harmonies, chord progressions was way beyond the early rock and roll pioneers, you might say, who were just using 3 chords and blues progressions and all this kind of thing. And it's a tribute to the Beatles as writers that they really changed that.
The director for Middle Tennessee State University Center for Popular Music, Dr. Dale Cockrell, says he can hardly talk about the Beatles without getting personal.
And I was 17 years old when the Beatles first came to the United States. And the songs of the Beatles actually defined my adolescence during that period. I mean, I want to hold your hand, and I know exactly whose hand I wanted to hold.
I wanna hold your hand.
Cockrell says our cultural world changed when the Beatles first arrived in early 1964.
It's really that date that the 50s ended and the 60s began. From then on, we had pop music icons to whom we could attach our hopes and aspirations, our dreams. And from then on, the history of rock music changed.
The city never has witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles.
MTSU's Dale Cockrell says having the Beatles come over from England for their first appearance before a U.S. audience on The Ed Sullivan Show changed the world.
The 80 million people trying to tune in to see The Ed Sullivan Show in February was, I think at the time, the largest entertainment audience in the history of television, a record that was held for a very long time.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away.
Beatles had a huge impact on Nashville.
Belmont professor Don Cusick says the Beatles were influenced by country music as well as R&B, but he admits the biggest influence on the Beatles has come from those who were coming of age when they were stars, the 1964 to 1970 period.
I know a lot of songwriters, musicians were heavily influenced by the Beatles. A lot of Beatles songs were cut in Nashville. Chet Atkins' best-selling album was Picks on the Beatles. Ringo came here to recorded Bouquet of Blues albums. Paul McCartney came here, stayed about 6 weeks and did some recording.
The eras of the Fab Four evolved from the initial Beatlemania to a psychedelic period.
I think I'm gonna be sad. I think it's today. Yeah. It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. Got a good reason for taking the easy way out. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. I am the Eggman. They are the Eggman. I am the walrus.
Once again, TSU professor Mark Crawford.
When you think about the period when they hit 1964, and if I believe this is right, they quit touring by 1967, so they really didn't tour that much in the States. And in that short amount of time, how many times they did reinvent themselves, their music, their look. So again, trendsetters in that respect.
MTSU's Dale Cockrell says the Beatles brought a group mentality that was different from Elvis or Sinatra, and they had several eras of music, beginning with early simple love songs in 1964.
To the Revolver album in 1965 and 1966 was Rubber Soul, and so there's a remarkable transformation in their musical sensibility and in their composition. And then by the time you get to Sgt. Pepper, they're imagining writing these big pieces in which all of the music fits together.
The final era of the Beatles occurred from 1968 to 1970.
Say you want a revolution, well, you know. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better.
Here is Professor of Music Business and Popular Music Studies at Middle Tennessee State University, John Dugan.
The Beatles weren't about just simply replicating what they were doing and meeting audience expectations. As they grew as a band, their musical style changed, their appearances changed. They weren't locked into an image for the entirety of their career. I mean, when you go back and look at their career, it's an 8-year period. It goes from 1962 to 1970. There are 3 or 4 times where they've changed as a band. Imagine bands that were working on a record in 1967 and then Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band comes out. And let's say you're in a, whatever band, and then you hear that record and you think, oh, geez, now how are we going to match something like that? What are we going to do to kind of up the musical and cultural ante?
What would you think if I sang out a tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me?
Whenever I talk about the Beatles and lecture on the Beatles, it's tracing this really astonishing musical development from 1964 to 1968 and 69 that's really still unprecedented in the history of popular music.
Belmont's Don Cusick says the Beatles are a current act with this generation.
I take students to London every other year. We spend a day in Liverpool. And the students, they don't know a lot about the history of the Beatles as individuals, but they know the songs.
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me.
MTSU's John Dugan and TSU's Mark Crawford agree. The lasting legacy of the Beatles is one of creativity.
They were commercially successful throughout the entirety of their career. They took enormous creative risks, and I think the legacy is the fact that you can be commercially successful, be true to yourself as an artist, and still take risks, and not necessarily worry about how your audience is going to react.
Everybody bows down to the Beatles. If you're in music, pop music, Paul McCartney, Ringo being the only ones surviving. But to their tribute, I think the music has really what's survived. And you can get caught up in an artist's image, but that's superficial. But their music really holds them.
Dale Cockrell says by the time the Beatles broke up in 1970, they led a generation of adolescents into adulthood.
They became adults in the 1970s, as did we. And the music is reflective of that. Their music changed, but their lives changed, and they were so important to us as model that the generation had to change as a result of the Beatles.
I'm Terry Likes. You're listening to Tennessee Matters from the Tennessee Radio Network.